In March of 1974, a film was released that took the world by storm. It became the film to watch if you wanted to scare the bejesus out of yourself. We had heard on the TV and other forms of media back then that it was so scary that people were being carried out of the cinemas after fainting. Ambulances were set up outside when the film ran. As curious youngsters, we would stand outside the local cinema when it finally came to our city, just to see if people were that scared. And they were. The film was The Exorcist. It was a film like we hadn't seen before, where horror was concerned. It was the start of my curiosity with the world of the unexplained, and especially the supernatural. The amount of publicity it got, whether it was good or bad, drove myself and a friend to sneak in to watch it. At the time it was a good idea. Then we got to the possession part. I watched until I couldn't watch anymore. While staring at the carpet, my friend nudged me and we saw two girls were being carried out because they felt sick. My friend then asked if I didn't mind if we left. We both left at a remarkable, and now I think about it, an impressive speed. You know, that walk fast, nearly run style down the steps and out the door. That night I could not sleep, and certainly not in my bed, as I was convinced it was going to be shaken by a bloody demon. Gosh. It didn't help when the next day in RI, religious instruction, my friend mentioned to the teacher why we were tired. Boy, did he berate us. Then he topped it off with, "It's based on a true story." It was just what I needed to hear. Not. It took me weeks to block it out of my mind and finally feel at ease in my bed. When the film came out on video in 1988, it was banned in the UK, but was still shown in some cinemas. It would be 11 years before they lifted the ban. The film was, and still is, the only film that has truly scared me. Oddly, that is disappointing, as I want to feel that emotion from a supernatural film, but I haven't since. After being told it was based on a true story, it made me more curious about the truth behind the book written by William Peter Blatty. I explored it to some extent and got the basics, but back then we didn't have the internet. Yay for the internet. So this is a story about a young boy called Ronald Edwin Hunkeler. Well, as much as I know anyway. There are many differing accounts of what exactly happened. The story has been twisted and contorted along the way. I can only go by what I have come across over the past few months. Born the 1st of June 1935, Ronald, an only child, lived with his evangelical Lutheran mother and non-practicing Catholic father. His German grandmother also lived in the home with them. Ronald, although close with his parents, had a good and close relationship with his Aunt Tilly. She was young at heart and he enjoyed her company. They spent a lot of time together, sharing similar interests. Tilly was very interested in spiritualism and considered herself to be a spiritualist. His grandmother, it's stated, was also very spiritual. Tilly would eventually become fascinated with the Ouija board. The temptation to use it to try and communicate with those that had passed became very alluring to her. And Ronald, who spent most of his time with her, would also start to show some interest. Tilly and Ronald would play with the board regularly. Eventually, Ronald would play alone. It's said that on Saturday, January the 15th, 1949, Ronald's parents went out leaving 14-year-old Ronald with his grandmother. Out of boredom, he decided to play with the Ouija board alone. It's said that while he was playing, both he and his grandmother heard a constant dripping noise. Ronald and his grandmother went round the whole house, checking all the taps, but nothing was turned on. The sound continued. They were confused as to where it was coming from. They entered a room where a picture of Christ hung on the wall, and they were shocked to see it shaking violently as if it was going to crash to the ground. They looked for a logical answer, but couldn't find one. The shaking eventually stopped, leaving them puzzled. Not off. When the parents returned home later that night, it's claimed they heard scratching coming from the walls. The father put it down to mice. An exterminator was called the next day. When they came, they could not find any sign of mice anywhere in the house. The sounds continued coming from the walls and the ceiling. Even through all of this, Tilly and Ronald would apparently continue to play with the Ouija board, trying to get answers as to where the noises were coming from. Unfortunately, on January the 26th, 1949, Ronald's Aunt Tilly passed away suddenly, and knows she had been suffering with multiple sclerosis before passing at the age of 54. Apparently and understandably, Ronald was devastated by the death of his aunt. He delved into the Ouija board more, trying desperately to make contact with his aunt. This went on for days, and his family began to worry about him playing with the board. They hoped his obsession would fade, but then one night something strange happened. Ronald woke up feeling cold. Realizing his blankets had somehow slipped off him, he pulled them back up. Within a few seconds, the blankets were pulled violently off him again. He was startled. Sitting upright on the bed, he heard scratching on his mattress. It was then that the bed began to shake with such force he couldn't get out. Apparently this went on sporadically for some time. His family growing more and more frightened, they started to wonder if the obsession he had had with the board and to try and contact his aunt was the reason this was happening. Was his aunt doing this? Mrs. Hunkeler believed it was. She recalled calling out to her sister after feeling a gust of cold air and hearing 3 knocks on the day Tilly had died. She challenged it with crying out, "Tilly, If that is you, knock 4 times. It responded with 4 knocks. But Mrs. Hunkeler wouldn't believe her sister would do this to them, especially Ronald. She wouldn't harm him. It was all getting too much for the family, so Mrs. Hunkeler turned to Reverend Luther Schultz, a Lutheran minister from her church. Another minister joined him as well, a rabbi who apparently had extensive dealings with possessions and hauntings. They spoke to Ronald on his own. When he suddenly had a fit and lashed out, he threw a chair across the room and spoke in a different language. The rabbi cried out, "He's speaking my language. I know it." Just to state, I don't know if there was a rabbi there. Schultz had the family take Hunkeler to the mental hygiene clinic of the University of Maryland for testing. He was tested twice with nothing abnormal discovered. Reverend Schultz also had J.B. Rhine, the founder of Parapsychology Laboratory at Duke University, and his wife, Louisa Rhine, come to evaluate the boy, but they saw no activity. They basically saw him as a healthy young 14-year-old that might be acting up a little bit because of the death of his Aunt Tilly. On February the 17th, Schultz asked the Hunkeler family if Ronald could stay with them for a while, so he could observe him. All went well for a while. The daylight hours were non-eventful. They chatted, swapped jokes, and talked about their dreams. But then the day turned to darkness, and the demons wanted to play. That night, the Reverend heard loud scratching coming from Ronald's room. On opening the door, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Ronald's bed was shaking and levitating in the air. Ronald was sat in a chair next to the bed. He just stared into the darkness. The Reverend watched as the chair Ronald sat on slowly started to turn and tilt. Then as he watched in horror, the Reverend saw something on Ronald's skin. Looking into Ronald's dark eyes as he edged closer, he noticed the lines on his skin forming shapes. They moved over Ronald's body like a serpent. Ronald didn't move. Frozen in fear, the Reverend saw the markings swell in size. He tried to get closer. Then suddenly the welts on Ronald's skin opened and burst. Reverend Schultz moved away from the boy. That no longer resembled the boy he'd gotten to know. Backing up, looking into the red glaring eyes staring back at him, he backed out of the door and locked it securely behind him, all the while listening to the guttural laughter coming from within the room. He called the Hunkelers and told them to get in touch with the Catholic Church as soon as possible, as he didn't have the knowledge to deal with what was happening to their son. Evidence suggests Mrs. Hunkeler took her son to a single consultation in February 1949 with Father Edward Albert Hughes at St. James's Church in Mount Rainier, Maryland, where he was assigned as assistant pastor. There seems to be differing reports, which makes all this difficult, but it's reported that the Hunkelers begged Father Hughes to help their son. He took pity on them and suggested that he talk to Ronald before any action would be taken. At the interview, Father Hughes felt the cold air as soon as he walked into the room where Ronald waited. As the father asked questions, he noted Ronald's agitation, and as time went on, his agitation turned to aggression, spitting out the words, quote, "You bloody piece of shit, I will slaughter you and all your family and drag you to the pits of hell. This body is my new home, and I will rise up legions to protect it. I will never let you take this body away from me." Close quote. Again, I don't know if that actually happened, but it's claimed. It's also claimed that the father, still unconvinced, laughed at this and brushed it aside. This made Ronald angry. His eyes black and filled with hate, he flew at the father. Ronald's father lunged at his son to stop him harming Hughes. Ronald was forced back into the chair and held there by Mr. Hunkeler. While staring at the father, he spewed out words in Latin that only the father picked up on and understood. Apparently, nobody else heard this, but Father Hughes knew Ronald had just threatened him. It was also claimed that Hughes's assistant pastor, Frank Boba, told an investigator that Father Hughes was thrown against a wall by an unseen force. It was then that the father realised he needed to do something and called upon Cardinal Patrick A. O'Boyle to authorise an exorcism. Ronald Edwin Hunkeler was admitted to Georgetown University Hospital under his real name on the morning of Monday, February the 28th, 1949. The first exorcism. Apparently the first exorcism took place at the Georgetown Hospital. Father Hughes was assisted by his pastor. Ronald was tied to a bed for his own safety. Father Hughes began. He recited prayers over and over. He demanded that the demon leave Ronald's body. Ronald lay on the bed sweating and spitting at the two fathers while they continued to pray over him. Ronald constantly shouted abuse at them, but they ignored him. Through all the praying, Ronald tried to free himself but couldn't. Eventually, they noticed Ronald's skin colour coming back, and a look of defeat and peace seemed to show on his face as he slumped down on the bed. Father Hughes sighed, smiled, and went over to Ronald, placed a cross on his chest, and blessed him. Now it's alleged that while the father tried to talk to him, Ronald suddenly opened his eyes and screamed obscenities at him. He fought against the ties that held him and managed to tear them off. A bed spring ripped away from the mattress, and Roland used it to cut Father Hughes on the arm. Bleeding profusely, he was taken out of the room. It's alleged that the good father had stitches, but more worrying, suffered psychologically, and it's claimed that the events of that night caused him to have a mental breakdown. When Ronald was left alone, he seemed to become himself. although confused as to what had happened. As he wasn't in any need of medical help, the hospital released him. News quickly spread around the town of a failed exorcism. People spoke of the Catholic priest being hurt and how it had affected him mentally. It's around this time that Ronald's mother claimed to have seen the words Lewis scratched onto Ronald's body. She asked if it meant St. Louis. It responded yes. The Hunkeler family acted on this and departed to an aunt in Normandy, Missouri, near St. Louis. The aunt had a dear friend in the church, and she had asked him if he would help the family. Father Bishop of St. Louis Church, who was also a professor of the St. Louis University, agreed, and a meeting between himself, his good friend Father Bowden, and the Hunkeler family was arranged. On the 9th of March 1949, Father Bishop, along with a young Jesuit priest, Father Walter Halloran, visited Ronald. When they saw Ronald, they realized as soon as they saw him that his condition had deteriorated. He'd stopped eating, threatened anyone who came near him, and his chest was covered in blood from all the scratches on his body. The father stayed with Ronald, said a prayer, and witnessed for himself as the bed started to vibrate. Ronald did indeed need his help. On the 11th of March, Father William S. Bowden of St. Francis Xavier Church asked to meet the Hunkelers. On meeting Ronald, Father Bowden read the Novena Prayer of St. Francis Xavier and placed a crucifix under the boy's pillow. After everyone had left the room, a loud noise was heard, and, reportedly, a large bookcase had moved. A bench was turned over, and the crucifix had been moved to the edge of the bed. The mattress was also reported to shake, and doors were said to slam on their own. Father Bowden immediately called his Archbishop. On the 16th of March, Archbishop Joseph E. Ritter gave Father Bowden permission to begin the formal rite of exorcism, the first of the second series of exorcisms, and it was to be performed at the Normandy, Missouri home. Thank you for watching.